Hello and welcome to the Beef Age, the Teagasc Beef Podcast, for all your latest news, information and advice for Irish beef farmers. I'm Catherine Egan, and as silage season is fast approaching, I spoke to expert Joe Patton about the importance of silage quality on beef farms. But first, I asked Joe, where are we when it comes to silage quality nationally?
Where we are nationally, based on what samples have been run through the labs, etc., we're roughly at about 65 DMD, so 65 dry matter digestibility. So what does that mean really in terms of quality? It means that national average, we're probably at a type of feed that's probably suitable only really for dry suckler cows that will not gain any weight. It certainly wouldn't be material that will result in any weight gain in cattle of any degree. So that's where we are national average. But of course, we have to remember that it's a very small percentage of silages that's actually sampled. My hunch would be that a lot of the stuff that isn't sampled is probably lower than that again. So I'd say somewhere in the low to mid 60s is probably where we're at. And
why is it this low, do you think?
Good question. I suppose, look, if you want to look at it this way, if you don't really if you don't put much of an emphasis on making quality material, Catherine, and you sort of wait until the early mid-June period to take your cuts, inevitably that's where you're going to end up with in terms of digestibility. So mid-60s DMD comes from really farms that probably haven't put much emphasis at all on quality and are looking for bulk only. So generally, really, the main reason for that is that on average people are cutting their silage much too late.
And what impact does this have then next winter?
Well, next winter, look, if you're talking about that mid-60s, we would like to see that more sort of in the low to mid 70s. So maybe instead of 66, maybe more like 72, 73. The difference that would make, and there have been a lot of feed trials done over a lot of years looking at that. The difference that would make really, if you're talking, for example, for weanling stock, if you take it from a November to March winter period, that 2-week difference in cutting date is the difference in about 60 kilos of live weight gain over the winter period for a weanling. So if you want to see what's the difference in weight in 2 weeks to cut your silage, the difference is about 50 to 60 kilos difference in the weight of weanlings coming out of the shed next spring. And that's very, very significant indeed.
Yeah, it is a significant impact. And what other key factors will affect the digestibility?
Well, look, the main factor really is digestibility is, look, the silage itself is only ever going to be as good as the grass that is being put into the bale or into the pit in the first place. So I suppose, look, you want to look at it this way, if you looked at the silage crop that you're cutting and ask yourself, how would animals perform if they were grazing that material? And if it's very long, very stemmy, if there's a lot of seed head in it, if it's shot out, if it's lying over, the digestibility is going to be very low. So really it's about stage of growth at the stage that it's cut is the big thing. So really once grass heads out, you're probably no more than about 69, 70 DMD. And every sort of 2 or 3 day delay after that, you're going to lose about a unit. So from a leafy crop, in sort of, let's say, on the 25th of May to a very stemmy crop on the 10th of June, that's the difference really in digestibility. And particularly with very heavy crops that lie over, if you've got dead material at the base, that's certainly going to drop your DMD by another 2 or 3 points. And of course, then you'd also have the issue that some swards aren't grazed at all tightly in the back end of the year or maybe in the spring. If there's a lot of dead material at the base, that'll take a few points of digestibility off as well. But the big one we can focus on now is the stage at which the crop is actually cut.
So from once the farmer cuts the crop, what should they do then in order to ensure the quality remains in the crop?
Well, look, I suppose that's the big thing really, that the decision around quality, the decision around digestibility and feed quality ultimately is a decision around cutting date, Catherine. And that, I suppose you often see that people think, yeah, that's very well preserved, or it's really done well in good conditions. But if the quality of grass is poor to begin with, there's no treatment post cutting that's going to improve it. But look at from a management point of view after cutting, I suppose the few things that'll make a difference, obviously, and everybody's well aware of this. Obviously, if it's pit silage, it has to be well compacted, sealed very quickly. And in fairness, with the way silage making equipment has gone now, most farms are able to get their silage in within the day or two anyway. So like really slow filling of pits like used to happen years ago doesn't happen anymore. That's off the table. From a bales point of view, obviously the bales have to be well wrapped and well managed to minimize losses. One thing I suppose you could mention, and maybe it's worth talking about too, is the question of wilting. Wilting to get the dry matter of the crop up maybe close to maybe 28-30% is a good thing. But if wilting goes on too long, you can get losses in digestibility as well by just the crop being in the row for too long, I suppose.
So how long of a wilt would you be recommending from once the crop is cut?
Yeah, well, look, that's a good question too. The wilting itself really depends on it's a factor of, I suppose, the time, and also how the crop is managed, I suppose. If you have, for example, 6 meters in the row, if you leave that for 24 hours, you're really not going to get a wilt on it at all. So it's not really worth your while almost. So the difference in dry matter percent is not going to be huge. If it's a 3 meter row, you'll probably get some drying out for sort of over 24 hours. You'd almost need 48 hours to get where you need to be. So really, like, if we're serious about wilting and really serious about high quality silage, the best combination, I suppose, is grass that's tedded out and that it's wilted for 24 hours. That would be the recommendation. Leaving it too long in the row, you're going to get too much loss. If it's a big row, you're not going to get it. You're not going to get it to dry out anyway. So tedded out, 24-hour wilt, job done.
An often worry among a lot of farmers is in relation to the amount of nitrogen and whether it's gone out of the crop, and that will be specifically an issue this year where a lot of surplus paddocks may have been taken out in the coming days. What advice have you for farmers in this case?
I suppose people say it's an issue this year. It comes up every year, and I've seen fellas that the nitrogen is gone out of the crop weeks ago and they're still worrying about nitrogen. I suppose a lot of people have the idea of 2 units a day in their head, and they will not, under penalty of death almost, they won't go and cut their silage before the 2 units per day rule is used up. Our advice is very clear on this, and it has been said for years. The 2 unit rule is a reasonably good guide for when you should apply your fertilizer. Okay, it's a good guide for roughly when the crop should get its nitrogen, right? But when it comes to making decisions around cutting date, it's really not that useful at all. So I think people need to stop worrying so much about nitrogen in grass, particularly in a bale silage, and particularly if you can get it wilted out. So you can cut silage that has nitrate levels of 800 parts per million or up. So on the nitrate test, it's still quite high maybe in nitrate, but as long as the sugars are high, and if you get a wilt on it at all, the nitrogen issue really takes care of itself. It's completely overplayed, and every year we have the same thing. Okay, so look, my advice is focus on the sugars, test the sugars if you're a bit worried about it, and focus on maybe getting a wilt for 24 hours. And don't worry, especially on them sort of surplus paddocks where the covers aren't that heavy, maybe perhaps, don't worry too much about the nitrogen content. The balance should be on the sugars, I would say. And
how can farmers impact or influence the sugars in the crop?
I suppose, look, if you're talking about good, dry, sunny weather, for sure, what does the crop do? It probably it takes in sunlight during the day. So if it's good, dry, sunny conditions, and if it gets good sunshine during the day, it will have built up the sugar. So, really mowing in the evening if possible. If it's a lush green crop, mow it in the evening when the sugars are likely to be, are relatively high. Leave it for its 24 hours to sort of ted it out. For 24 hours. What that will do basically is it will concentrate the sugar in you get rid of the water basically, and you concentrate the sugars that way. So therefore the crop will preserve quite well. And now look, it's an interesting one, Catherine. I did the Grange Open Day a couple of years ago where we had, very high quality silage, high 76, 78 DMD silage as a sample. And we also had silage that was maybe mid-60s in DMD, so very stemmy, dry stuff. And I would say, based on the people that passed us by that day, most people were sort of saying they preferred the low DMD silage. They thought it was a better they thought it was a better crop, if you know what I'm saying. And that surprised me a lot, actually. And part of the reason for that, I suppose, is that the very high DMD silage looks darker, it's softer looking, it doesn't have that sort of fill value look that the lower DMD stuff would be. And a lot of that would be because it's higher in crude protein. So this silage will be softer, I suppose, and the bales won't maybe be as tight. It won't look as tight as maybe the low DMD stuff. But that's what makes a good bale, actually. It's not a bale that holds its shape. It's a bale that falls apart when you open it. That's what good feed value looks like. But I think a lot of people are a bit concerned about how that stuff will feed out. I think we need to move on from that and say, look, that's the type of bales we really need if we're feeding them to animals that we need to grow. The situation obviously is different for your dry suckler cow, where mid-60s is probably okay. But if we have growing cattle on the farm, or particularly maybe sucklers that are freshly calved and need some feed quality, it's the leafier silage that we need to go for.
It probably comes back to the age-old question of balancing quantity and quality.
Yeah. And look, just a comment on that, actually. People talk about balancing quality and quantity. It's very rare we'd ever get a call from anyone saying, "Oh, I'm worried about the quality of my bales." They're always worried about the number of bales they have, right? And that's an issue. But look, when we looked at the stuff from the fodder survey after 2018, when there was a big shortage of feed in the country, it was an interesting thing that stood out for us, actually. The farms that had the biggest problem in terms of shortage of silage were the ones who delayed their first cut the longest, right? And that's an important point, that delaying your first cut into one big cut increases the risk of a silage shortage. It doesn't reduce it, right? And that's something hard to get your head around. But when you think about what happened in 17 and 18, in 17 in particular, the problem was that a lot of farms didn't actually manage to get their second cut made. And the reason they didn't get their second cut made was that their first cut was too late. So actually taking a good quality first cut of good yield in the middle to the end, sort of the third week to the fourth week of May, gives you a much better chance of having enough silage than leaving your first cut into the middle of June, because what it does is it gives you a much better growth rate for the rest of the year. And I think that's a very important point. One big cut in June will not guarantee a supply of quantity, but what it will do is it'll guarantee a supply of very poor quality.
That's a good point, Joe. In relation to preservatives, they used to be used more commonly probably in the past. When is there a need for them, or does that impact on the quality of silage?
Sure, like the preservatives, like there's a whole, if you go back years and years ago, there was obviously acids being used and there was molasses being used, and maybe in more recent years then maybe preservatives like, inoculants and things like that, Catherine. So look, a couple of points on that. The first thing to say is that if you go back, maybe if you go back 30, 40 years ago, when these things were really at their peak, I suppose, when people are really trying to make that effort, a lot of the time, the swards that were being cut at that time were not ryegrass swards, right? They were older grasses. There would have been more meadow grasses and cocksfoot and things like that, the older style grasses, which naturally have a lower sugar content than your reseeded grass. Do you know what I mean? So your ryegrass sward or your reseeded grass sward comes with the sugars included, if you know what I'm saying, which is a different situation than it was years ago. So the old grasses would have been harder to preserve years ago. Now with ryegrass swards, they're easier to preserve because of the sugar content. So there's nobody using acid anymore, really. If the sugars are low in your grass, so if you're testing you're testing your sugars and they're a bit low, you're probably saying, look, a bit of molasses, maybe just add in the sugar that's missing. So maybe 15 kilograms a ton, or 15 liters a ton, I suppose, of molasses or something like that, just to give it a bit of extra sugar to help the fermentation. In poor conditions or in low sugar situations, you're adding straight sugar basically to try and improve the situation. But that can be decided with your advisor based on the current conditions and whether the grass itself is low in sugars. And oftentimes we see that in maybe a poor summer with poor weather conditions where people have to move even though the sugars in the grass aren't ideal. Then at that stage, you're adding in a sugar source. In terms of the inoculants, I suppose what we'd say in a lot of cases with the inoculants is for people maybe that are making silage in early to mid-May, a lot of the dairy guys might be looking at using them. Are they necessary? The jury's out, really. They're costly. If you're going to be feeding the silage to weanling weanling cattle, or you're going to be feeding it to circular cows. Is it necessary? In most cases, I don't think the inoculants is really going to give a cost benefit. I would say look at the sugars, and if you need sugar in there, add a bit of molasses. That's probably as far really as we need to go with the additives of the inoculants, I would say.
That's great, Joe. Finally, I suppose the impact of the decisions that farmers make now in relation to silage quality won't be realised until next winter. And you mentioned there the 60 kilo live weight gain of a difference in young weanlings. What can farmers do in the coming weeks in relation to cutting the crop in order to reduce costs and make the better quality silage that you're discussing?
I suppose, look, at this stage, Catherine, I'm convinced that everybody knows how to make good silage. Like, I think it's not an issue of knowing what to do. It's a matter of whether people feel that it's worth their while doing it or not. I think we have to get a couple of things. First of all, we have to get over a couple of notions here. The first notion is, as we discussed before, stop worrying about the 2 units of nitrogen rule, right? And take the silage cut take the silage cut in late May, before the good goes out of it effectively. So that's the first decision really is, I'm going to cut my silage in May this year rather than June. And once you make that decision, everything else can follow from that, I would think. That's the first thing. The second thing we need to realize is that, we can't make all our silage to suit all our cattle on the one day. So think about this. Your average guy, maybe with 20 suckler cows or thereabouts, how many bales of moderate quality material do they need? They need about, depending on the length of the winter, I suppose, somewhere between 6 and 8 bales, let's say 7 bales on average. So your average guy needs about 120 to 140 moderate quality bales for the suckler cows that they have. Everything else other than that should be high quality, right? So look, it's easy to make the bad stuff. Focus maybe in the first cut on making higher quality than you would be used to. That's done by advancing your cutting date back into sort of anywhere between the 20th and the 30th of May, I suppose. Take the cut, and your second cuts will be better as a result of that. So it's that notion that we can sort of do it all on the 15th of June and bring the baler in once and that's the job done. We're always going to end up in a situation of poor quality silage if that's the way we want to do it. I would encourage people maybe to look at it a bit different this year and watch the benefits accrue next year when you'll either get you'll get something in the region of maybe 50 to 60 kilos additional live weight gain for the same level of meal input, or indeed, if you want to cut the meal input and save a bit of cost that way, it's the difference in saving maybe 1.5 kilos or 2 kilos of meal per head per day over the winter period. That will add up to an awful lot.
Some key points, Joe, I think there that farmers are definitely going to use this May. Thanks very much for joining me on the show.
Okay, thanks very much.
That's all for this episode, and my thanks to Joe for joining me on the show. You can catch up on all other shows and interviews from the Beef Edge podcast on the Teagasc website at teagasc.ie, or you can listen on Apple and Google Podcasts as well as Spotify. Don't forget to rate, review and subscribe to the podcast so you never miss a show. For all other updates from our beef programme, keep an eye on our Twitter and Facebook pages. Until next time, I'm Catherine Egan and thanks for listening.